You're listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Now, it is time to break it down.
Welcome to episode number 6 of the Sonny Brown Breakdown, a podcast where we discuss the training, teaching, health, and education of mixed martial arts. I'm your host, Sonny Brown, and in this episode I talk to Jake Shannon. He's the founder of Scientific Wrestling and the king of catch wrestling tournaments. He's authored the best-selling book called Say Uncle, Catchers Catch Can Wrestling and the Roots of Ultimate Fighting, Pro Wrestling, and Modern Grappling, and also ghostwrote Billy Robinson's memoir titled Physical Chess, My Life in Catchers Catch Can Wrestling. He was also the assistant coach to Billy Robinson from 2007 to 2014 and currently has 2 instructionals out on BJJ Fanatics covering catch wrestling submissions and takedowns. Here we talk about how the history of submission grappling can trace its roots back to bored English miners who love to gamble, how Japanese MMA emerged out of the theatrical and entertainment-driven world of professional wrestling, and the moment a quirky professional wrestler bested the most famous grappling dynasty in fight sports, and how his professional wrestling training helped him to be able to do that, and how you could even still use a few of those tricks in your training practice today. Now let's go to the podcast. So Jake, many people when they talk about how they got into mixed martial arts, they've seen UFC 2 on videotape, and then that's how they learn about the sport. That's what inspired them to get into it. But you have to be one of the few people who can actually say that you were there live at UFC 2. Is that right?
Yeah. 1994, I had just seen, I was really into, there was a Bruce Lee movie that came out right around then, Jason Scott Lee. I was very into that. I had just gotten my ass kicked by my roommate, who's a judo guy. I had like a taekwondo black belt. So I thought I was going to be tough like Bruce Lee and challenge my buddy in the backyard. And he was like a judo green belt. And man, he just threw me all over the place. And I was like, whoa, I never really experienced grappling. So he and I started going to the Boulder Judo Club. And anyway, there was a flyer for UFC 2. And I was like, oh my God, we have to go. This is so crazy. So we actually go. I lucked out. If you get that old UFC 2 footage, you could see that there's a couple scenes where I'm waving to the camera, but I'm sitting right behind the Gracies, in fact, which was kind of neat. But yeah, I've been following this sport and mostly practicing grappling. I never did MMA. I just have always been, when I started in 94, I was probably, in addition to one of the first people to see the UFC live, I was probably one of the first people to practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Colorado, and for that matter, probably the United States. But yeah, I would pretty much say Colorado because there was nobody here doing it, and we'd have to fly in. Like Pedro Sauer was up in Salt Lake at the time, so we'd fly him down, and Caseca Munez, Ricardo Miguel, these guys. But there was back in like 94, 95, 96, there was no real Naga. There was no real Grappler's Quest. There was, Fight to Win. There weren't these opportunities like these young guys have today where you could go in and you could just enter tournaments until you start killing it, And so I kind of got a little burned out, to be honest. And instead of going into MMA, because there was really no opportunities for like a young guy that was not connected myself back. I went into pro wrestling. That was a whole other weird, bizarre detour. But it was what led me eventually to catch wrestling, because I never really did I thought pro wrestling was fun, but I've always liked grappling. Grappling is the thing that I've always done. I've always been drawn to it since I was really young. And all the guys in pro wrestling were always like, man, you need to learn about Lou Thez, man. He likes all the shit you like, and you need to learn about Carl Gotch and Vern Gagne and these other guys that were shooter pro wrestler types. And then right around that time, right around 99, 2000, Sakuraba came out, and I was training at a Japanese style pro wrestling dojo up in Northern California. It was put on by a couple of the gaijin wrestlers from Pro Wrestling Noah at the time, Michael Modest and Donovan Morgan's school up there, Pro Wrestling Iron or Pro Wrestling Tetsuo. And that was right when Sakuraba came through. And, back then, again, I've been around for like all these different phases of this sport from the very beginning. So it's really interesting to see the Evolution. But back then in like 2000, to say that you, first of all, didn't need Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to succeed in MMA, yet let alone that pro wrestling would be beating Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, people looked at you like you were a flat earther. It was the most preposterous. You had lost, but here was Sakuraba doing it and repeating the experiment over and over and over and over in such convincing fashion. I just happened to be in a very lucky position, and that's really when I started my research. So it's funny, it was actually MMA that brought me to catch wrestling, but it was by way of pro wrestling because I couldn't get into MMA.
Yeah, which is also funny because I think if we actually look at where MMA comes from or where pro wrestling comes from, if we go back to the very beginning, it actually is from catch wrestling, and I think even freestyle wrestling as well, and folk style wrestling. It all has their roots in catch wrestling. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the arguments can definitely be made for that. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could even make the argument that's not real popular in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu circles, but I mean, I think it's a defensible historical that without catch wrestling, BJJ wouldn't exist in the way it is. In fact, I think it's my opinion that guard work, what's the traditional story that Maeda went to Brazil, taught the Gracie clan, yada, yada, right? Mm-hmm. Well, Count Coma crafted his skill in catch wrestling tournaments against catch wrestlers. And it's my contention that that's where he learned how to be a bottom player, how to actually be offensive. So, I mean, it may not necessarily be orthodox, but I think it's a defensible position to say that even Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu owes its origins to catch wrestling. But yeah, it's not controversial. The first Olympics, you know how when, say, the Olympics first went to Korea, they allowed Taekwondo as an Olympic sport. They do that in the 1904 Olympics, it was in London. And so their sport that they entered was amateur catch can, which they dropped the name and called it freestyle. So yeah, freestyle, BJJ, obviously pro wrestling, that's not even really controversial. MMA, you could definitely say MMA through the Japanese route because, you can go back to the Inoki Muhammad Ali fight. That was largely Inoki's kind of pushing and whatnot, the Japanese promoter. But all the proto MMA that existed, I mean, some people include Pancrase, say that Pancrase opened its doors first before UFC. I think they held their first show like a month or something before UFC. But the people forget that the UWFI had a pay-per-view called Shoot Wrestling Real. And that preceded the UFC. And I honestly believe that it was the UWFI's, which is where Billy Robinson trained Sakuraba, ironically enough. I think that pay-per-view, because it was all the footage for the UWFI was filmed in Japan, and they had sellout. I mean, they were selling out like Kurakan Hall and all these fight venues back in the 80s with UWFI. I think that it's fair to say that Shoot Wrestling, it's real. Or Shoot Fighting, I think it's Shoot Wrestling, it's real. That pay-per-view in the early 90s was really what showed probably Orion and Hoyce, hey, why don't we do that? And let's do it on pay-per-view and all that kind of stuff in the early 90s because it was pretty successful, that review. Anyway, yeah, Catch Can's very, very interesting because it's totally obscure. Nobody really knows what the hell it is, but all the roads kind of go back to it, funny enough. Yeah,
because that's how I kind of became interested in it, is just obviously, start doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, never really heard of catch, even though I guess you could say Ken Shamrock, in those early days was catch. And then when I start reading about the history, I'm just like fascinated that there's this whole other lineage and tree that the more I read about it, the deeper it goes. And like just recently I'm reading that, Maeda competed in, I think it was like London World Catch Championships at some point and came like second or something, or semifinals, something like that. And it's like, I'd never heard that before. And I think it's probably a part of the story that might need to be told, or, should be more common knowledge at least. And so find that stuff fascinating. And I mean, so the evolution then of pro wrestling, is it right that it was the catch wrestlers that it, originated, before the judo's establishment of judo's Kodokan, and then they start their catch wrestling, but then they realize that, hey, if we start to, predetermine the outcomes, people get less injured, we can put on more exciting bouts, we can put on more bouts. Is that, and then that just slowly morphs into pro wrestling? Is that how that evolution happened?
Sort of. I mean, there were some key players. You know, you have to think. You have to think about, what does the word professional mean? You know, what does that mean, and why do people put that term and connect it to wrestling, and why is it connected to catch can? Well, catch wrestling has almost always been about money. Not money. No, I mean, sometimes there was honor involved, but largely it came about in an era when there was not Zoom, there wasn't Xbox or PlayStation or virtual reality or Tinder or Facebook or Instagram or any of that shit. I mean, they didn't even have TV, and they were all real poor. My point is this: people were really hungry, and the era in which catch kind of came about was like in the early mid 1800s in the northern parts of England, and I would also say Ireland. There was, because most of those early catch wrestlers' surnames, I'm fairly certain that because the Irish were probably doing something similar to this. There's an interesting amalgam and an evolution to it all. But anyway, it's a lot of these early guys, what they were doing, like they were the Irish coal miners, right, up in the north of England and in those territories. And after a long day of work, and Billy Robinson would tell me these stories, that, you know, what those Irish miners got was one meal a day. It was like toast with an egg and some beans. And then you went and picked coal, hunched over in a tunnel all day. And then when they were done with that, because they were so desperate and bored, they would bet on anything. I mean, they used to bet if you could jump into, you know, like those giant wooden barrels.
Yeah.
You know, that they would make bets if you could jump in or out of a barrel. I mean, they would do all kinds of stuff because they were bored. Well, one of the things they started doing was fighting, you know, and wrestling. And because a lot of these guys had to go back to work the next day, they weren't doing the bare knuckle stuff or the punching and kicking because they needed to use their hands, and they couldn't get cuts back then. You died of an infection. Yeah. You could die of gangrene poisoning easily. So they would do these, they started doing these more rough and tumble matches. But back when it started, it was illegal, because to wrestle on the ground itself was like forbidden. There's, you know, that was a big taboo. That's like, men don't do that. That's like but some of these poor people didn't give a shit, and they would just fight till, you know, they were fighting them, and they were wagering like a week's wages, you know. And those early professional wrestlers were the ones who were good enough that they made a living on bets. They were like we see professional poker players today. They quit their job and they just were alive betting on wrestling matches. Well, what ended up happening is the publicans, the people that ran the pubs back then, noticed everybody was gathering around watching these fights, and they just were like, well, shit, let's start hosting them over the beer and sell them some beer, and I can make some money. And those ended up being kind of the first promoters. And so what ends up happening is there's a dynamic change. The catch wrestling in the early days was a binary contract, right? It was between the two wrestlers or the two camps and their backers. Well, when the promoter came in, that was a third party, and that changed the dynamics, because then the promoter started paying, right? So, you know, it's who pays the piper calls the tune.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there was a lot of pressure then, whereas it used to be for bets and honor and this kind of thing where they wouldn't throw a fight. Sometimes the publican would be like, hey, well, stretch this shit out a while, make it 3 or 4 fights. You just can't win. You got to go back and forth. You know what I mean?
Yeah, makes sense.
And so just like any fighting sport, corruption starts to creep in when there's not proper oversight and those, you know, backstage or, you know, off the mat kind of dealings happening. So the promoters, it really changed when promoters and the money started getting really big. I mean, so, you know, you look at the kind of what I call the golden age of catch, 1910-ish, you know, right around the turn of the century, from the 19th into the 20th century. You know, it was the biggest sport in the United States. It was bigger than baseball was, boxing was. I mean, it was huge. And, you know, I think what ends up happening, and it's funny because Ronda Rousey just a tweet about pro wrestling and something about having all these big, tough pro wrestlers' egos deflated because they couldn't actually fight. And she just was being on a shoot about it. You know, she's like, well, I'm not going to. And then, but she followed it up with some very sound reasoning, which is what I've heard repeated from all kinds of different angles. And that is what you also alluded to, that, you know, these guys are fighting every week. I mean, you can't, as an MMA athlete, realistically fight and make a living. So you have to start figuring out how to work matches because the money's there. People are going to pay. They want to see it. I mean, we've proven that they don't even give a shit if it's real or not. They just want to see two people fight. And able to do that where you're doing it every single week and you're not completely destroyed, you got to start working the match. And so, boxing has had its works, but I will say this, while 90% of the people went where the money is, which is human nature, there's always been a strong, hardcore group that have maintained the integrity of catch as catch can as it. And so that's why you can, even today, while our numbers are minuscule compared to something like BJJ, I'd say for every competent BJJ guy, blue belt or above, for one catch wrestler, there's probably 10,000 blue belts or above for BJJ. It's just we don't have those numbers, and it is what it is. But despite that, there is a very small, almost like an oral tradition handed down, like Aborigine to Aborigine without writing it down, are these techniques in this canon of strategy. And, I was lucky to get it from Billy, same guy that Sakuraba got it from. Billy got it from some guys up in Wigan. And, it is a truly interesting story because you really have to go deeply into the subject, because there is a lot of weird shit. There's a lot of stuff you're just like, oh my God. And then that leads you down this whole other avenue of studies. So, it's fascinating. It's kept me busy.
That's exactly what I'm finding. So many little rabbit holes that you just keep going down that just.
Well, that's just the history. Wait till you get to technique. I probably have, I would guess off the top of my head, probably 7 or 8 different variations of a double wrist lock. That I've learned from catch wrestlers. And that's not even the double wrist locks from jiu-jitsu and stuff. So, it is deep, man. It's like martial arts. There's the cool thing is that catch happened at a time when there was a lot of photography and a lot of book publishing. So you can at least find a lot of it.
Yeah, that's one of the things that turned me onto it, is when you see these old photos of like, oh, I know this move, I know this move, I know this move. Like,
it's amazing. It shows that there's nothing new ever.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, I learned that one last week and here it is 100 years ago. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Or you think you invented it. That's the worst. When you're like, oh, fuck, I got this. And then you crack this book and you're like, motherfucker, God damn it. But that's the truth. People have been wrestling since day one.
Yeah.
Since day one, when somebody had a piece of meat or a mate or property or something, and the other guy wanted it, you had to wrestle. That was like that. So you can imagine the millions of permutations people have gone through. It's just how many times and rediscovered, Yeah. That's the thing that's interesting to me.
Well, that's like one thing. Whenever I try and mention to someone like, oh, wow, catch wrestling goes back to, 1900s or, 1870, whenever it is exactly, is the first thing someone will always respond with is, but it goes back to, as old as time itself. And I think, it's on hieroglyphs in the Egyptian walls. It goes back a lot. It goes back a long time, but there is something special about that, tracing that lineage back to this particular time in England, that we have the history recorded, that every other grappling sport seems to value being able to trace it back so much. And it's like, there's this point at time in England that we can say for sure this is where something definitely happened.
It's funny that you mentioned lineage. I don't mean to step on your words, but when you mention lineage, it's so funny because for me personally, I don't put a lot of weight in lineage. I look at each individual wrestler because there's a lot of guys that learn from Billy Robinson, one Sakuraba, you know what I mean? So that's not to say there are a lot of amazing guys that learn from him. But my point is that I'm fascinated by the history. In addition to, I'm even more obsessed with the actual sport, the technique and the strategy, but the history is fascinating. But I do find that a lot of people get hung up because they tend to bring a Eastern or maybe even Japanese sensibility of lineage, because those are very command and control. There's rank, there's like belts. It's kind of militaristic. It's about you'll lose to your sensei. You know what I mean? Like wrestling is kind of like, I don't give a fuck about belts unless it's gold. If it's a gold belt, then I'm good. And again, it's like going back to the money, and it's like, I don't even care about winning if you pay me, so like, it's a different approach. It is a completely different approach. And I do think that sometimes, I think a lot of, I study business. I really love, and that probably is why I'm biased to looking at the business side of this as well. But I have to hand it to Hori on that, really, because from a marketing standpoint, the tables have completely flipped. Everybody knows of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's so baffling for me. I ended up moving to San Francisco in 94 or 95 when I graduated because there was no jiu-jitsu. So I went and trained with Carly Gracie in San Francisco, and then a very short while after that with Half's Gym when he opened it. And Kurt Osiander. I really never took a class with Half, but Kurt Osiander was running the classes. But you couldn't find anything here. I had to move like 5 states away, and I did so, and I worked 3 minimum wage jobs in one of the most expensive cities in the world to pursue this passion for this grappling sport. And to see where it's come from then when you had to move some crazy place I literally have in this little town, this suburb town that I live in, there's probably 4 different Brazilian schools with black belts. So they really went to town, man. I have to laud them on the business side of things. And, it's a little bit of, I'm not going to lie, it's a little bit of propaganda sometimes when I see a lot of moves renamed and history's forgotten, that I know that these people know this stuff. But I mean, you can't blame it. It's just teachers. So, I mean, you can't blame these people. They're making a lot of money, and it's become a huge growth industry. And in fact, I actually, there's another thing too that I think happens is a lot of times, you know how it is. I mean, fighters want to fight. So, if you are a Brazilian guy, there's this automatic assumption that you can't like catch wrestling, or if you're a catch wrestling guy, you can't like BJJ. And I mean, honestly, both from a business perspective, but also from training partners and actually getting to wrestle, most of our guys come from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu first. The vast majority, come through Jiu-Jitsu. So I'm very grateful for what they were able to do and how they were able to influence the culture on such a mega way. I do obviously aspire personally to catch some sort of recognition, but when I started my business, I tried to kind of emulate the Gracie business models that have sprung up. That is having a gym and, doing it like that way that everybody else was doing it. And I just couldn't get it going. But it was because I was doing catch in a very hardcore way. Yeah. And so the practices were too hard. I even joke with my friend Rolly Delgado, who's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt in Arkansas. He had Billy, when Billy Robinson was alive, he was living in Arkansas for 7 years or whatever. And he would go down to this gym and help coach. But Rolly called me up one time. He's like, man, can I just talk to you? And I'm like, yeah, what's up, man? And he's like, I think I got to fire Billy. And I'm like, what happened? I thought something crazy happened. And he's like, he's just too hardcore. He scares everybody off. Nobody wants to work that hard. And not that they don't want to work that hard, but they don't want to do that like grind, nasty, like college wrestling level practice of just insanity, And that's true. Nobody wants to fucking do that shit, dude. Like you're going to have a hard time if your way of making money is open gyms and you got to get members to do that. I always struggled. I could never get people. So I could see why something like Pancrase has, where they end up getting these stud athletes and create a stable, and then they have those guys all fight. You know what I mean? Because it's much
exactly
difficult. You got to treat it like a college wrestling room, which is just one of the hardest being, like a conditioning.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what's, my interest lately has been in obviously this and folk style wrestling. And I'm very lucky to have a coach who's moved out to Australia from New Jersey, Gary Jones with the Wrestling Foundation. And I mean, he's recently put in like a system of levels just to, give people that idea of progress to kind of, let them work
for retention. You have to do that. I mean, that's the martial arts business model is a very good business model in terms of retention. The other thing that wrestling has problems with is retention. And that's because it is that nasty attitude of like, I only care about gold. Well, guess what? The other 100 guys that are in the competition, only a few people are winning something. Yep. The rest of the guys get nothing ever, even if they've been in for 25 years. So it's interesting, but folk style, it's interesting you mentioned folk style. I would argue to say that folk style is probably one of the purest expressions of catch as you can, minus the submit. Yeah. There's catch is kind of the fountainhead, and there's all these like offshoots that come from catch camp, pro wrestling, grappling, all those, pro wrestling is interesting because it just became theater, but the hardest expression of the sport ended up going through, obviously freestyle and folk style. Now freestyle became anybody who follows wrestling knows these basics, that freestyle is like the international expression of kind of catch as catch can. And folk style is the more is the American version of that evolution for catch wrestling. It's very interesting, man. There's a lot of like, you go back and you look at the books, and you can look at the amateur, the folk style amateur catch can rule books from like the early books by the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union here in the United States. And they have jiu-jitsu people called kimuras, they have double wrist locks, they have submissions, basically, but you can't tap. So, they're using these submissions to make the guy go over to his back. So all it is you're tapping, but it's rolling over into a pin is your tap. Yeah.
That's definitely one thing I've noticed, from doing folk style wrestling now, and especially with my coaches, that while you can't tap and there's no submissions, there will be some moves or just wrestling rides that one cause you a lot of pain, and the way out of that pain is rolling to your back. And so essentially sometimes the pin can sometimes be a submission, because you're just like, man, I want to get out of this. He's giving me a way out, go to my back. I'm going to take it. Although of course you should never do that. You should, go to the end, but that's where it does feel like that's a possibility.
100%. Yeah. It got to the point where I had to, because again, you have to remember, I was like, swimming against the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu stream. So forever, people are like, well, what's the relevance of pinning? No, pinning don't matter. Da, 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 da. Well, a guy by the name of Eddie Bravo came around with a catch wrestling pin and built an entire platform around it. So pinning is very important. And so that got me thinking like, well, that is only one of many kinds of pins that I know people tap to. This twister, or what's known prior is the wrestler's guillotine. There's, all kinds of really awful pins like that. And because of that, and because of the history of catch, when it was very popular and being practiced widely, there were statistics, and you could see that most matches were won a pin. There were people that would win because the other guy would give up and say uncle and all kind of stuff. But by and large, the majority were through pins. So that really got me thinking, like, because a lot, I was trying to make catch relevant, and I had so many people in my ear like, oh, take pins out, just leave it grappling and have jiu-jitsu strategy when you're underneath, but catch wrestling on top. And there's plenty of people doing that. I just didn't want to do that. And I kept pondering the importance of this pin. It is why, without submissions, folk style wrestling is the greatest base for MMA, statistically speaking. But like by a margin that's so wide, you can't like really argue. You really don't have much of an argument against it. The pin gives you, in military parlance, the strategic high ground. This is why it matters in a fight. I could shoot a gun downhill better than that, right? Like this basic fundamental fact about fighting on a planet with gravity that you don't want to be on. You want to have the high ground. So anyway, I never really gave up on it and kept pushing this idea of finishers. And I've been very, very lucky to work with, arguably the greatest wrestler to live that we have recorded, and that's Wade Chalice. But Guinness Book of World Records for the most wins, the most pins, the most wins over international champions, most wins over national champions. He's a 5-time All-American, which is very difficult to do in one sport, to become an All-American. I mean, that's a very high level, and he's a 5-time, all of them in combat sports, freestyle, folk style, Greco, judo, and sambo. So, the guy is truly a savant, truly like a genius. And, I've been very fortunate that way to have one coach that's at that level, and I'm referring to Billy Robinson. And I wouldn't really consider Wade a coach because I was too old when I really started learning from him. But he's definitely a mentor and definitely changed my way of coaching and the way I think about wrestling in a very profound way. And nobody knows who the hell he is. That's the irony. Nobody, like so few people know, and he's truly the greatest. And you look at him and he looks like, some cross between Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. He doesn't look like Karelin, Yeah.
So. And I mean, the fascinating thing too, when talking about the usefulness of pins, is when I've been looking into how, like recently, pins could be utilized in MMA. We've got for the striking game, of course, people are now trying to get back up to their feet as quick as possible. They don't want to be pinned down. So that's one thing I've been using for training my MMA guys. It's like 3 seconds on your back, that's a pin. Let's start again. You got to be scrambling to get back to your feet as soon as possible. And then
if you're on your back, it's going to be hard to get points even if you're punching. Like right. The guy on top is definitely got an advantage in terms of racking up the score sheet on the punches. Mm-hmm. So there is so many advantages to that top game, and the easiest way to practice that is with a pin. You don't have to get a concussion. You don't have to worry about cutting somebody open or, breaking a bone in your hand. You can just drill really hard with pins. And I think that's why freestyle, folk style is translated so well over to mixed martial arts.
So the fascinating thing is with the interplay of the pin in MMA is obviously the Gracies made their name by becoming so good off their backs, spending so much time there that they were able to use it as an offensive position. And that really, built their, a foundational element of their style. But then now I've started looking at Kazushi Sakuraba. He whenever he got taken down onto his back, he didn't let himself get pinned. He was always just constantly turning to his belly, rolling to his knees.
Right. And how mind-blowing is that? Especially in 2000, he was giving people his back. That was the craziest shit to see these guys get his back. It was so exciting given the context of that time, because everybody thought Sakuraba was toast the second. But every time he just did wrist control and shucked him somehow off his back. And next thing you know, the fight's back where they started.
It was like, I think the fact that he had been training that so much and it had been neglected, that he was able to capitalize on people's infamiliarity with someone actually doing that, and able to turn that into an advantage of his own. And when I've been looking back into the history, I find out the Wigan Snake Pit, it actually got the name Snake Pit because it was said that if you threw a wrestler, he'd turn to his belly and bite you. And I'm like, man, that's exactly what happened with Sakuraba.
That's interesting. Yeah, Sakuraba was pivotal, man, because truly I was already down. I probably would have stayed in more of the performance side of pro wrestling if it wasn't for Sakuraba. But man, I was only really doing that for about 3 or 4 years. I actually did fairly well, relatively speaking. There's very few spaces at the top, and I had tryouts with WWE. I was able to tour the United States and actually get paid, and 50 different city tour, that kind of stuff. So, I had some success in it, but man, when Sakuraba came, I was done. I was like, this is what I must. It was just such an epiphany. Sakuraba to me, he's like almost like a mythical character. I almost don't want to ever meet him. And I run in so small circles with him. I don't want to meet him in a way, just because he's just, such an epic figure in my life. Because when he started doing that, it was such a revelation to me, given that like, oh yeah, it's like you're a flat earther if you don't toe the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu line, because they were killing everybody. But then I was like, I got to figure this out. And Sakuraba had probably two of the best coaches in terms of complementary. How would you say that? They complemented each other.
Yeah.
And that's obviously Billy Robinson, but Shozo Sasahara, who was an Olympic medalist for Japan, I think in the late 70s, he was Sakuraba's coach through what was either high school or college, whatever the equivalent is there in Japan. And you could just see it. Like, he is such a natural at all these moves and has drilled them so many times. And Sakuraba was truly somebody special in the history of but not only MMA. Can you imagine he's in the UFC Hall of Fame and only fought one fight? And now he defeated the first Brazilian. He was in that UFC.
Yeah, first person to tap out a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt.
Yeah, Conan, right? And he outweighed him. Conan was huge compared to Sakuraba.
Yeah, well, that's also another interesting thing with Sakuraba, is that he did fight so many bigger opponents. And one of the common criticisms I've heard when people mention catch wrestling is that it's only big man moves, or, you know, it only works for bigger, or it only works in weight class? What would you, like, how would you, you know, respond to those?
Combination of two things. One, a lot of catch wrestlers were, I mean, in particular, somebody like Carl Gotch, massive men, like 6'4", 6'5", and truly strong. Like Carl could squat something like 5 kilo under the world record. I mean, he was just massively strong. He was also nimble. He could do like ring gymnastics as a heavyweight. You know, like he's just incredibly strong, incredibly good. So, of course, people are going to sometimes think of characters like that are just these big, strong guys, and they're just going to cut the muscle. But I do think that's a disservice, because most catch wrestlers historically have looked a lot more like Hoist Gracie than they do Ken Shamrock. Historically, I mean, Wino Katonen was a long, lanky guy. Farmer Burns was lanky. Most of those guys, that was actually the typical build. So it's not really. I understand why people think that. And also because, you know, I think a lot of times some of the ad copy of some of the people out there selling catch wrestling merchandise, they just go that route, you know, just that like 250-pound guy who just abuses you in the gym, like in their marketing, you know what I mean? Okay. And so I could see why the misconceptions are there, but it's, in fact, the most dangerous catch wrestlers were always lanky and like Hoist.
Yeah, so, I mean, Carl Gotch, he's a pivotal figure, I believe, in Sakuraba's development as well, because now, you'll know this better than I, obviously. You've met Carl Gotch and worked with him yourself, I believe, and he left America for Japan at some point and started teaching over there. Is that correct?
So it's kind of interesting. So, you were mentioning the snake pit earlier. The first record that I ever seen, and this is what I was told by a number of people, and then I actually saw the article, was a press junket, was Carl in a press junket called it a snake pit. And the name stuck, right? But it's really, that was Riley's gym, and now it's become more of a brand thing where I think Miyato in Japan was probably the first guy to use it. And then the guys over in Wigan restarted up. And then Joel Bain here in the United States uses the name. So it's a very symbolic and powerful kind of brand within this small little subculture. But Carl, so, you know, Carl, it was an interesting guy. I got to be close with him in the last about 4 years of his life. We would have weekly phone calls. So, I mean, now they call that shit like remote coaching or some shit. But I don't really consider him my coach. But he was very much a mentor. So when I was first running my first Catch as Catch Can club, it was at the Santa Monica High School. The first one that was formal. I had some that were just like, we do it out on lawns and shit, but it was, you know, that was at the very beginning. But we moved into the Santa Monica High School. Actually, a friend of mine, a great guy, amazing athlete, Mark Schultz, I'm a gold medalist in wrestling. He hooked me up with that gym. And anyway, so I was just starting out. I didn't know what I was doing, but I had Carl on the phone. And so he figured out how to run practices, how to, you know, talk to the guys, the things that are important to be looking for from a coaching perspective that were not technique based, because I couldn't really learn technique because he was in Florida and I was in California. You know, especially back then, it was like there was no video phones or anything like that. Yeah. So I got to be very close, and I for anybody who's interested, Carl let me record a number of the conversations. Some of them were just boring me and him bullshitting, but you know, mostly it's me bugging him about stuff, catch wrestling related. And I have all those recordings up. It's got to be 20 hours at least that I video let me record over at scientificwrestling.com. It's just the Carl Gotch chats or something when you get to scientificwrestling.com. But Carl was interesting, man. He was a tough dude, and he was 12 years older than Billy. So you have to understand he's a whole other generation, right? You think of somebody 12 years older than you, wrestling you know? Yeah. So it's a whole different kind of generation. Now, Carl came up. He always described himself as a poor boy that grew up on the waterfront. And he took to wrestling. His mother, he got in a fight or something. His mother put him in it. And if I remember correctly, his dad and him didn't get along that well. But he did really well. He ended up becoming something like, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I keep so many of these different scores in my head, or these different records. But I think he was 7-time Belgium champ for Greco and freestyle. I want to say that. Anyway, it found him a spot at the Olympics in 48, which was again back in London. And while he was there, I think he placed like 7th or something in the world. So it's not nothing to sneeze at. I think he was there for Greco. I could be wrong about that. It was one of the two, obviously, but I think it was Greco. Anyway, he placed like 7th or somewhere between 7th and 10th, something like that at those Olympics. Anyway, while he was there, Billy Robinson's uncle, a guy by the name of Alf Robinson, there's old pictures. He was a famous boxer. He fought like Max Baer and guys like that. And he was also a pro wrestler. And that's how kind of Billy got into pro wrestling, was through his uncle Alf. Well, Alf was at those Olympics and was kind of like a road agent for Wigan, and because they were up in Manchester, which is very close, and he was a champion wrestler and boxer. So he saw Carl at those 48 Olympics and invited him to come out to Wigan. In Wigan, they ended up calling him Chesty because he was always, some people would call him arrogant. But he was just very confident, and didn't like bullshit and wasn't very patient. But he goes to Wigan, and even the little middleweights were beating his ass. And he just kind of had this like epiphany, like, this is what I need. This is my life's mission. And so he stayed there for approximately a decade, give or take a couple of years, and came to America. But, Carl had a hard time getting over in America. There's always this like kind of rivalry that historians bring up of that era between Carl Gotch and Lou Thesz, the two notorious shooters from pro wrestling in that era. They were both the same age. Both had Hungarian backgrounds. But Lou made a killing, became super wealthy, one of the wealthiest people to ever work in pro wrestling, whereas Carl never did, okay? But who had more influence on wrestling? I would argue Carl did, because he was probably single-handedly responsible for MMA.
Yeah.
As we know it today. So it's kind of, and the number 2 largest pro wrestling organization, New Japan Pro Wrestling, was one that he had a hand in. I mean, the guy was massively influential. So anyway, Carl, when he came to the United States, just got a reputation for being difficult to work with, because he didn't like losing, because he was actually a real wrestler, found himself in this phony pro wrestling shit, and just was getting frustrated because he wasn't charismatic or didn't have some stupid gimmick. And he's like, why am I having to lose all the time? So anyway, Buddy Rogers, the very first guy to call himself the Nature Boy, was one of the biggest stars ever. And in the locker room, Carl and him got into a fight, and basically Carl beat the fucking shit out of him. The guy ended up calling the police, and Carl I think he almost got deported or something. Anyway, Carl was very poor at one point. He was working as a garbage man, I think, in Hawaii for a little bit. Long story short, one of his buddies, Big Bill Miller, was already working in Japan and said, hey, man, come on out here. And then the rest is, as they say, history. His attitude, his combat, his fighting spirit was like, he became what is known as the god of wrestling in Japan, because, Japan being a very combat sport oriented culture,
Yeah.
From karate to judo to, the little kids are all fighting. Anyway, so Carl goes to Japan and becomes massively influential because he's going to the Kodokan and beating up the judokas there and getting mad respect over. And then Inoki, ironically, half Brazilian, half Japanese, Inoki ends up becoming this star, and he and Carl get aligned, and they just rode the wave, man. So you ended up having the Ali fight, which Gene LaBelle was the ref for. You end up having New Japan starting, which is this strong style, which is more of a combat style of pro wrestling. You have the UWF, which has all of Carl Gotch's students in it. And then the UWF splits off in splinters, which eventually becomes like Pancrase. Mm-hmm. And then Pride, and so anyway, that takes you kind of to the modern time. But yeah. Carl was involved in the mix of all of that in some crucial way.
Yeah,
but he never had anything to do with Sakuraba directly.
No,
Billy. That was Billy.
Not directly. But from my understanding, like he was the factor that led to this creation of this strong style or shoot style wrestling. Is that?
Yeah, strong style. So then strong style, which, is again, the second biggest pro wrestling company in the world after WWE is New Japan Pro Wrestling. Mm-hmm. And New Japan Pro Wrestling is strong style. That is like this. It's a really tough way to wrestle. Like most guys who do pro wrestling in the United States would really not last long in that system. It's very tough. It's a lot like MMA. It's tough on the body. You have to be particularly durable. It's a rough way to go about things. Anyway, but beyond that, beyond New Japan, there was things that begin to splinter off, and you end up with these what I call proto MMA organizations like the UWF, Rings, UWFI, Pro Wrestling Fujiwara Gumi, Shuto. There's all of these but they all come from Carl, most of them. The majority of them, they can trace their way back to Carl. So Carl was massively influential in terms of continuing catch wrestling through the late 20th century into the beginning of the 21st.
Yeah, well, that the Shudo and the UWFI, I'm fascinated in at the moment, researching about Sakuraba, because one thing I've read is that he was inspired to take up wrestling at a young age from the comic book or the manga, Japanese manga of Tiger Mask. And the manga told a story about a professional wrestler who also fought crime, something like that. And that inspired Sakuraba to take up wrestling, and eventually leads him into professional wrestling, which at the time was the UWFI. And I don't know, was Tiger Mask involved in that? Because his name, it was Satoyo Sayama? Or?
Yeah, so Sayama was probably one of Karl Gotch's most famous students. So, yeah, but he wasn't in the UWFI. He was in the UWF, but there's matches. I mean, he fought everywhere. He was kind of like Sakuraba in a way. If you watch those pro wrestling matches with him, the guy was out of this world. Like the way he could move was so insane, like and ahead of anything anybody else was doing. And today, a lot of the guys, you know how like breakdancing in the 80s was mind blowing. Nobody could do it. Now everybody can kind of do these things. A lot of the pro wrestlers can do it, but it was so innovative the way Tiger Mask wrestled. And so, yeah, in that way, yeah, Carl, it's interesting because he had Carl as an inspiration and Billy as a coach.
Yeah, it's a fascinating little. That's what I'm. These little rabbit holes that go down.
Yeah.
with this story, and it's all all seems to link up. And then so Sakuraba's in this UWFI that then has Billy Robinson coaching these professional wrestlers to wrestle in a style that is that's catch wrestling, obviously, but to wrestle, put on performances in a style to entertain, but at the basis of it, they're doing real catch wrestling. Is that roughly what's going on in the UWFI?
I mean, yes, the UWFI, the outcomes were preordained, right? So they knew that, say, Takada, who was very popular, he was the Hulk Hogan of that promotion, that Takada was going to win. Okay, they knew that because they were doing that in the writing or in what's known in the wrestling world as the booking. So, but what they would do a lot of times, and they did have some shoots. So I know, for example, and his name is just slipping my mind right now, Billy Scott. He's a great guy who fought for the UWFI, but he also had to fight like a pro boxer. I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody who was a real boxer, like a pro fighter, and that was a shoot. And so they would mix in a couple shoots where they really felt confident that they would win, but it was mostly works. But what you do in pro wrestling that you want to keep it real or kind of exciting is, so you could do this. This is actually a great thing for BJJ and MMA guys as a practice method. And this has been something that catch wrestlers have done that work in pro wrestling for a long time. And that is that you wrestle from hold to hold. So let's say you and I square off. I mean, you're a lot younger than me and I'm out of the game. So, but we're hypothetically staring at each other. We get seated and we get drawn to where we have to wrestle a match. I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. whistle blows and we go, right? In a worked match, if we want to make it go on, you and I are going to wrestle, and say you have a wicked single leg or something. You get the single leg, you put me into a Achilles right off that, or a heel hook or something. But you and I both know that you got that heel hook because I could tap it. You just don't crank it. You hold it. You just work the hold. We wrestle for real, but then you work that hold, and I work to get out of it, just like you would do in a drill in your gym. And then I get out of it and you try something else, and so basically what you're doing is you're wrestling, but you're just not taking home any of the moves. Do you understand? Like as soon as you know you can beat a guy, you ease up off the gas a bit, let him counter or escape, and then you start up again.
Yeah, that's what I've been noticing when I'm watching Sakuraba's pro wrestling matches, is that I'm starting to think in a way it was kind of like sparring that he was doing in the
everybody
ring in pro wrestling.
Everybody on Instagram, what do they call it? Flow rolling now or some shit. I'm like, dude, this is chain wrestling and fucking pro wrestling and amateur wrestling for hundreds of years. Chain wrestling.
Yeah, so I think a common misconception with pro wrestling is that with the predetermined outcomes that they've worked out, every single move in a match. And I don't know if that is the case for some matches, but it seems to me that, like, watching the UWFI matches, that they're really just, going from instincts and just, going with the moves and just coming up, just flowing with it, flow rolling with it exactly with the moves. But yeah, just like working from instincts as if they're sparring. Is that how those pro wrestling matches or all pro wrestling matches work?
Well, so what you'll do, this is the great thing, and what I teach, because I've been teaching at a pro wrestling school of all things recently. I've taught everywhere from BJJ to schools to high school wrestling gyms to, and this one now I'm at this pro wrestling school, and what I have them doing is learning how to wrestle, because what typically you want to do is you want to be able to have a guy who actually can wrestle, because then you just go in and do that. You do your flow roll and you wrestle, or what I call wrestle from hold to hold. You're scrambling. You're actually trying to win. And when you get it, you just don't take it home and let the guy get out so you can keep going and earn a check. People don't want to see a 2-minute match. They want it to go on for a half hour or whatever, Anyway, that doesn't have to be scripted. You don't have to call it in the ring, which is another way of pro wrestling works. You don't have to do any of that shit. You can just wrestle. But that takes two people who actually can decently wrestle. Because, as you know, trying to wrestle like a white belt or something, they're fucking dangerous. They're spastic. They don't know you don't want to work with that guy. You know what I mean? You're going to go in and kill him. But anyway, so what they do a lot of days now, or in some of these more shoot-oriented, is they'll wrestle from hold to hold. But then beforehand, they'll say, okay, listen, I want to get off my, I don't know, some finishing move or some big spot. You know what I mean? And you want to get yours off. And so they figure out at some point how to cue that the other guy has to kind of fake being exhausted so the other guy can climb up to the top rope or whatever. Or they will call it during a match sometimes too, if they can feel the energy of the crowd like a jazz musician, and they can riff. They can start saying, okay, now I'm just going to, hey, I'll toss you off the ropes, sunset flip and yada, yada. They just call it that way too. So there's a bunch of different ways you can do it and keep it a little more spontaneous feeling and authentic. It's weird to me that you can, for example, in the United States, you can have somebody like Ronda Rousey or Randy Couture or somebody like that go through MMA, do all this kind of stuff, be great, and then go into what was that movie, The Invisibles, or what's the one? The
Expendables.
Expendables, yeah. And nobody is like, that's fake, right? You know that the Expendables isn't real. And it's like, well, what's the difference between him doing that and Ronda Rousey going into WWE? No shit, it's not real. John Wick's not real, but it's fucking cool shit to watch that shit. And to see somebody really doing these crazy moves and giving you ideas and inspiring you. And so, there's different ways to do pro wrestling. The problem is that WWE has been so successful, and that's great for them. I'm happy for them. It's amazing to me that it's, now after this economy tanking, now I think it's valued at like $3 billion or something. But just the idea that there's a group of men in their underpants pretending to fight and it's worth $3 billion is like amazing to me. But, I think that WWE is such a strong brand and been so powerful and commanding of media that people don't understand that there is all the, like, pro wrestling's got all kinds of facets to it. It's not just one-sided. There's all kinds of different styles of pro wrestling. And personally, I include MMA in pro wrestling. Now, I consider it to be a style of pro wrestling. It's just a no pin, shoot cage match. You know?
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting crossover with, tracing that history. And as you mentioned before, professional wrestling kind of starting where the promoters got involved and the idea came to, make it more for money, is that there's this, the promotional side of the UFC that we can kind of see drifting more and more to, like using things from the pro wrestling playbook with trash talk and with their promotional tactics, where it kind of fought so hard to be accepted as a real sport early on. And, has kind of got that acceptance, but kind of not really. Like, it's in this gray area that keeps, like shifting from one side to the other, it seems. And definitely recently it seems to start slowly shifting back, and just some elements creeping in from that pro wrestling playbook.
Colby Covington, or you look at Conor McGregor, or you look at Chael Sonnen. I mean, these are guys that, Muhammad Ali took from the pro wrestling playbook, and cutting promos and hyping up matches. And it's just, you got to do that if you're going to make money. You've got to have drama. You've got to have people care. So, one of the things HBO did to revitalize boxing were those like documentaries, that they would film building up to the matches and stuff, and that is as big a part of this sport as anything. And so I do think people kind of get obsessed with this mentality of like trying to figure out who's truly the best. And it's just, man, any day somebody's got your number there. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, that's true. That's the truth.
It's better to think in terms of like making money and not like trying to figure out who's the best, because figuring out who's the best, that might be interesting, but that'll change in 5 minutes. Whereas building a business is sustainable. You can keep running these contests indefinitely, and maybe you got to figure out maybe they are shady. Maybe you are lying to people and saying it's a straight contest when it's not, but you got to keep the business alive somehow. So it's an interesting thing to watch. And, it's also interesting to see the mafia involvement with professional sports, and in particular in Japan. That's really what killed Pride, which kind of the ultimate, in my mind, the pro wrestling version of MMA was the Yakuza. And so, there's it's just shady dealings, man. What can you do? That happens in governments. It happens everywhere. It's a difficult thing.
Yeah. And that's the funny thing I find about this is it's like, it seems to be this small microcosm of everything that happens in life and the world, government, whatever, but it's kind of,
oh man,
it's like, it's all laid out. Like we know it's, there's no theater anymore. We know it's theater, but it's just all these little things start to interact and influence each other.
Yeah.
And like even with like the time, the theater and, using that for a promotional element. It's funny. A conversation I've had before is with in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I don't know if you've seen, like on Instagram, a lot of people will put out, Instagram moves that, look, the idea is you want it just to look as cool as possible. You don't want to, like a nice, slow choke, crushing pressure from side control. No one's going to watch that for a minute-long video. It has to be like a minute of something exciting. I don't know what it is. And sometimes people put out stuff and you're like, that move, that's a bit dicey. I don't know if that'll ever work. But,
but they're all doing the same thing. They're all hustling, man. They're all trying to get there, and it could be total bullshit, but they're hustling. That's a total truth. It's very funny to watch all these people doing these flow moves and stuff. And it's so funny because you find back in the early days of MMA, people making fun of traditional martial arts. But I look at all these like intricate things that are people doing. It's like grappling kata.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, okay, that's cool, but try to pull that off.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating too, because we talked about Eddie Bravo bringing the wrestling pin into jiu-jitsu with the twister, wrestler's guillotine, turning it into a whole system. I don't know if you're aware that he's put out now a whole system of 10th Planet warm-ups which he has a system. So all his schools around the world every week do the same set of warm-ups, which is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu kata. It's a set of moves that they work through, just flowing from one to another, and work great on Instagram as well for promo. They put those out, and they look excellent. But it is definitely, his inspiration for that was also kata as well. Like, he wanted guys to be able to work something, just off the bat. And so that kind of links up back into that as well, which it's just all seems to keep being interconnected.
Well, the good thing about that kind of thing is that this is one thing that was missing in, the jiu-jitsu when I started, is there was like no drilling. There was no drilling. The Brazilian guy would come in with his Portuguese accent, show you how to do kind of a paintbrush version of a top wrist lock, and then everybody would wrestle for like an hour, And you go to a wrestling room, I mean, you look at somebody who's just a genius on the mat, like Kerry Colat, and he's like, dude, I'm like 90% wrestling. 90% drilling, And it's a whole different way of looking at things. And that is what it sounds like Bravo is doing with these warm-ups. It almost sounds like drilling moves, which is a very important part that I think, the modern grappling scene could really learn a lot from folk style wrestling. And that is just that drilling ethic. I mean, you always have to wrestle and you have to spar, but like drilling, it's boring as shit, but that's how you get the muscle memory in, so you don't have to think about it. It just automatically happens.
Yeah, well, that's other conversations I've had recently is how we can make those drilling, sessions more enjoyable and turning it into games and things like that. And
well, you have to when it's run as a school where you have students paying to be entertained. That's that's a form of fitness and entertainment for them. Whereas if you have like a bunch of guys you hired to put on a TV show and they are getting a paycheck and they don't drill, they get fired. It's different. The pro wrestler is different than the part-time grappling enthusiast as well. It changes everything. I've given up on the idea of trying to get a school going. I'm just teaching coaches now, but my real vision is to actually get a promotion going so I can coach a few all-American level athletes with this and use that as a showcase, because it is amazing to see somebody like Sakuraba or Tamura and they tangle and it's like, holy shit, this scramble is just like amazing to watch because it's counter, recounter.
Yeah, that Sakuraba versus Tamura match, if anyone wants to go watch that is a great one to view for that shoot style wrestling look. I've watched that a couple of times over the last week, and I'm just that's given me a lot of these thoughts that I've had recently. And it's, even the thought I'm having now is like, so what is a good way to make that drilling fun and entertaining? And like, well, hang on, that's what you were saying with hold, what do you call it? Hold to hold, and like, oh, hang on, then we're going back into that shoot stuff.
You could think about it this way, because, and I don't know the laws where you're at. They're completely different than the United States. But for example, in the United States, you don't have to get the state athletic commission involved unless there's punching or kicking. So you can hold a grappling tournament, and it's you could just do it as long as you have insurance, right?
Insurance is a big thing here, I'm sure.
But that's also what they get away with pro wrestling here too. Like, pro wrestling doesn't have to have, it's just, so you could conceivably do something with your school, because this is actually how pro wrestling schools operate. They charge their students, and then the students are really kind of pay to play performers. They pay to enter the school, and then the school has a promotion attached to it that they'll put on a show every month and put the students in the show. Yeah. You could run a pro wrestling show, but have it shoot style. And every month, just your local guys, your school, you get a state, you have them bring family and friends, and it's not a big deal. It's not some serious thing like a tournament. It's just your own promotion, your little school. Yeah. You're like a smoker almost. So there are ways you could maybe motivate people that are more aligned with the catch wrestling attitude. But training, the end in training for a pro wrestler is that performance, is that competition, that time when it's, do I win or do I lose, and it's all on me kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think nerves and public performance are a big part of it too.
Yeah. I actually think that's a great idea. To get, you could say, hey, you guys go work out something, make sure you entertain us. and go, go put something together and yet make a night of it. Even my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, with my coach, Anthony Lang, a couple of years ago, he decided he wanted to change up the gradings a little bit, which were, a demonstration of moves. And now the brown belts have to put on exactly that. The brown belt's got to, pick someone, you guys come up with something.
Right.
And put it on, because the grading, everyone's there.
Yeah, but imagine you do that and then you let people wear like glittery underpants and masks and capes and they come out to rock and roll music and fireworks. Like that's like the greatest thing you could ever do.
I kid you not. My coach's wife, Nikki Lang, when she got her black belt, when she did her one for her black belt, that's what she did. She had a smoke machine.
Yeah, nice.
I played the music.
Nice. She had an entrance theme and everything.
She had an entrance, and then she came out and did the performance. She worked with Nuz, one of the brown belts, and they did it all together. It was great. They'd been working.
That's pro wrestling. You just need to do that every time. That's pro wrestling right there.
That's fascinating, man. It all links. It all comes full circle. I love it. That's so good.
But, it's interesting because it is important sometimes, the mentality and the reasons why people do things, pro wrestling is different. A lot of jiu-jitsu people come up because they want self-defense. Most people who are in pro wrestling is because they love pro wrestling. They love all of it. They love the craziness, the violence, the beauty of it, the ridiculousness of it. They love all of it. So it's different. It is just sometimes a little bit of a different sense about the sensibility.
Yeah, well, that's where it came from. Is like for Anthony to do it. I think it's like, hey guys, let's, you guys know at this stage, he knows everyone that's been doing it long enough. He knows what they're doing. He's like, hey, let's have some fun. Let's make this enjoyable for everyone sitting around. I know where you guys are at, but let's change it from just a rote memorization of techniques or a display to let's have some fun and make this more enjoyable. Let's make this entertaining again.
And think about the amount of time somebody will drill or rehearse or go through the same move when they know they've got to perform in front of all their friends and they don't have to worry about the embarrassment of getting their ass kicked, but they're going to actually have to perform the move the right way.
Yeah.
So you don't get better drilling than that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of sports science, I think, about the pressure of performance, being critical to actually get good training results is, bringing all those elements in of a timer and trying to make things as much like game day as possible or match day will actually improve the quality of your training. So that's just having that audience there watching your performance, I assume would be another way to get a bit of that effect crossing over as well. So,
yeah, you learn when you're in front of a big crowd, you learn to like block them out.
Yeah.
But it's like anything, it takes repetition. You can't, it's like if you're going your first day and it's a huge crowd, that can be a whole factor that you hadn't really anticipated.
Yeah. It changes it definitely. That's when we've had like little just amateur MMA shows is the first thing everyone just, in the gym, little gym battles. First thing everyone comes out when they say is like, oh, it's a lot different when everyone's standing around looking at you, dead silent. It just changes the dynamic so much.
That transition between when I was coaching catch on like the beach, when I lived on Venice Beach in LA, to the time I was at the Santa Monica High School, there was a 6-month period where I went to Gene LaBelle's school. It was actually go-court for about 6 months. Mm-hmm. And I got to roll with guys like Manny Gamburian. Carl wasn't really there, but I got to roll with Gokor, who just kicked my ass. The guy was just so amazing. His foot sweeps were like something I'd never really seen before. But one of the things that they did at that school, and again, and probably a lot of it had to do with Gene LaBelle's influence too, was that they would have, at the end of every month, they'd have an intra-school tournament. Only the school. You know what I mean? Nobody else is invited, just that school. You have a little club tournament in-house every month. And, I think it's important for developing that kind of inoculation to being in front of a crowd and have people watch you grapple or wrestle. It's important.
Yeah. It's so funny that it seems like there's looking at the two people competing in the combat sports or wrestling, no matter what it is, you've got the two competitors and then above them, there seems to be the promoter or, the money that can influence the wrestling performance in so many different ways. And then on the bottom side, you've got the audience, which can also influence. And there's like this interaction between all those things that will just change the end product or the end result so much. But at the end of the day, it's all that human instinct to wrestle or for combat sports. And so with that in mind, what would you think then, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu some other things that they could possibly learn from catch wrestling? Or, maybe not even necessarily techniques. I'm sure there's heaps of those, but what are some takeaways that you think could be more integrated?
I've really kind of, gone all in on this catch wrestling thing. Like I've really taken this on as a bit of an experiment starting back in 2003. And so not only trying to learn the history, promote the history, learn the techniques, promote the techniques, but also to create the sport. And I'll tell you this, I've loved grappling for a very long, long time. And my friends that don't like grappling, believe it or not, I do have some friends that don't like grappling.
Yeah.
They can't fucking watch it.
Yeah.
Can't fucking watch it because it's so boring. Okay.
Yep.
To us players, it's not boring because we know what's going on. But it's not like football or baseball or soccer or, whatever, where you could sit down and figure it out in one game, what's going on, and then become a fan, become a spectator. You just don't see it. Even, guys like Gary Tonin and Gordon Ryan and all that, they're making some good money, but it's still not like huge numbers. It's not like boxing numbers. It's not like, MMA numbers, because it's a more complicated thing. Now, here's the one thing that I think that grappling in general could learn from catch wrestling. And by the way, I've said this elsewhere, but I think it bears repeating. I look at these top guys in grappling now, from Nicky Rods to Gordon Ryan, and they're all freaking jacked and, in no gi. I mean, it looks like the Lion's Den from the early 90s.
It does. There's no longer the little man going around.
It's all like the truths that I think that have run through, because catch wrestling's been around for so long. It's experimented with a lot of different things, and it, like any system, finds what works and disregards what doesn't. And it's been around for a long, long time. And I think one of the things that it's found is that adding the pin makes submission grappling, adding the pin to submission grappling makes it viable as a spectator sport. Because the pin pushes the action, and when the guy's putting a shoulder up to try to get his shoulders off the mat, he opens himself up for submissions. It pushes the action. So a lot of people look down on it, but I'm like, listen, I think it's integral to the success of actually having a professional grappling system is the pin. I think it's important. It pushes the action. So people who don't play the sport will actually spend money to watch it. I truly believe that. And I can make an analogy. Look at MMA. If I were to simply replace striking with pinning, MMA and catch wrestling are the same thing. It's a 2-vector game. I can win with a knockout or a submission. I can win with a pin or a submission. It's simple.
Yeah, that's that element to be able to make it exciting and make it watchable for the general public. I mean, that's something that even, watching black belt matches, especially in the gi, sometimes for jiu-jitsu, it can be hard when it's just long portions of not much happening.
Yeah, judo, anything like it, it has the same problem. And I honestly do believe it's the pin.
Yeah, so it's funny that, again, Eddie Bravo, he's been one that's been trying to, mix around with the format with his EBI tournaments, where his main goal was to try and get grappling on television or just try to make it exciting. So, he brought in just sub only. No points, only subs, 10-minute matches. He brought in some overtime stuff, which people seem to really enjoy at the beginning. People were really into it because it seems like, the Danaher guys came in and really tore that, they tore up all those early tournaments, just dominating. And they were incredibly exciting matches when they put those on, because they were just steamrolling around. That's kind of when people started to take notice. again, it's funny. I've heard Danaher, he's written once that he says his system shares some philosophies with catch wrestling, but he hasn't gone into that any deeper that I've been able to find.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I've never seen one of his videos. I've seen him. Obviously, the guy is very famous and a very successful coach, so I know who he is. But I've never really watched any of his systems or his videos or whatever. It's just, I just can't focus on it that long.
It's very difficult. He's a dry talker.
I mean, I'm a quant. Like, I have my master's degree in math, and so I could be as nerdy and wonky as possible, but I also know how to change the inflection of my voice, or anyway. Yes. So the point of it is the guy has obviously been very successful, but from looking at the catalog of things he offers, I mean, he's the first guy in jiu-jitsu that I see actually talking about pinning.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Like, and again, everybody talks about, Danaher and this leg lock stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, these are things that we've been saying for like a long fucking time, guys. And I will give Danaher credit that he's open-minded and he's integrating it into the system. And so, yeah, I mean, I look at all the Danaher Death Squad, leg locking, flexing their muscles and all that kind of stuff. And it's just like, man, this is like the lion's den all over again.
Yeah. And promoting themselves on social media. Those guys are the biggest, Gordon Ryan started showing up in the crown and the cape and doing all that, tearing through with leg locks. And now everyone talks about pins in grappling. Everything's a pinning position. We just it'll just be holding someone there, not the finish of the match.
I know that you've been around for a while, and somebody like me, I'm an old grandpa that's been around forever. So I just could tell you, just the level of bullshit sometimes is baffling to me, because just like I remember having arguments about leg locks to people. I remember having arguments about pinning to people. And so now it's like when everybody jumps on the bandwagon, it's great, because I'm like, yes, fuck, awesome, let's do this. Let's do leg locks, let's pin. Let's try throwing in like Nelson's next, or actually let's get real crazy and start using wrist locks, not double wrist locks, like actually attacking the wrist joint, or spine locks. Like there's so much that's not being used.
Yeah. Still. Okay. It's fascinating, because there was that history of leg locks in catch wrestling for a while, wasn't there?
Oh, geez. I mean, even Sambo recognizes that Sambo got its leg locks originally from catch wrestling. And then, they went off on their own and refined it in their own way for their own sport and their own rules, and did fantastic. But the other thing that I think is really missing, like I'm hoping, I am just one guy, and I'm very grateful for any way that I've been able to contribute to this sport. I'm very grateful, because I love this sport, and just to be a part of it is just something amazing. I mean, I'm talking grappling as a whole, but I am also realistic, and I know that my influence is not very far beyond catch wrestling circles, so and that's a very small circle. So I do hope guys like Danaher and Bravo continue to use these other methods to innovate the sports that they're in. The one that I'm really hoping somebody's going to bust wide open and start using in a methodical way against jiu-jitsu is cradles. I've been on this bandwagon for probably 15 years now, that cradles are like truly everywhere. They are truly everywhere if you just got to look for them. And they are such a difficult position to get out of once you're in one. And I find that jiu-jitsu guys are always in a bad position with regards to cradles, like a lot. So I hope maybe somebody listening to your show, because you probably have more influence than I do in MMA, that they start really trying to integrate cradles as an offensive weapon, or even as a passing weapon. I mean, obviously a lot of my guys and stuff know this and have been working out their own systems and doing great. But what I'm saying is some of these Danaher guys too, cradles are so amazing, man. They have so much application in grappling.
That's actually one thing I'm with you on that 100%. I've been working on cradles, in trying to integrate them in my game as well. And I actually did a seminar with Matthew Tesler, who's a Danaher brown belt over here. And one of the things he showed was a cradle. So you never know.
Nice. Good. Okay, good. Yes.
Where that could go. Because, there's definitely a lot of combat potential, or just a great technique to be working into things.
Well, I mean, also for your wrestling, it's the best hold for wrestling as well. You know, and when you figure out how to bring them over to the submission game, I mean, you could set up leg locks and toe holds and knee bars. There's so many crazy things you can do from a cradle, let alone just passing the guard.
Yeah, that's where I think there'll be a lot of use for it. Like one taking the back's a huge one, but yeah, leg entries. I think it will be a good way to explore that into the future. And yeah, with the leg entries and the Danaher guys, what's your take on the recent crossover matches that Gordon Ryan again's been having with Bo Nickel, Pat Downey, and taking on these wrestling guys? And like, I'm sure you probably feel the same way, but I'm watching these matches going, why don't they add a pin to these and just make this pin or submit? And then wouldn't that be a fair representation of the rules? What do you think of that? Well,
I'm 100% with you on that thought. Like, I'm very much like, oh fuck, guys, you're so close. Just please,
so close, right? So
please,
close.
Just do a pin. And these matches are totally easy, and you'd have all this historical precedent. I mean, anyway. However, the good news, the silver lining to that is that they're getting close. And in fact, this is how most of the matches back is, that they were these weird rules that were agreed upon by both sides. And this is when I was talking about the difference between having a promoter who puts out a uniform set of rules, whereas you have two fighters negotiating rules. Do you understand? So it changes the sport a little bit. And so I am, like a lot of times what they would do back is they would do the best 2 or 3, but match 1 would be catch, match 2 would be collar and elbow, and match 3 would be Greco-Roman. Do you understand?
Okay. Yeah.
And catch has this big, this is the other thing, like catch is not really it doesn't lend itself to an authoritarian top-down command structure. It's more of a grassroots bottom-up thing. They definitely meet in the middle often, but I think it's more of a grassroots thing. And the importance of that is that there are variants in these rules, man. I could go back and look at all the different rule sets that have been published, and there have been a million more than that are just agreed upon between bettors, but like you could have the strangle barred, you could have the full Nelson barred, you could have toe holds barred, you could have a 3-count pin, you could have a 5-count pin, you could have a pin where it had to be both shoulders, or a pin where it had to be both shoulders and a hip down for the count to start. So these variant rules that you see in modern grappling, as like these guys are trying to find a place to meet in the middle. Yeah. It's just weird to me. It almost, I'm just going to be honest here, like it's like maybe smacks of a little insecurity that they don't want to go to pro wrestling. It seems so obvious. Like they're like doing every other rule variant possible, but the one where the jiu-jitsu and the wrestling guy could meet.
Yeah, okay.
But I mean, I don't know. That depends on how much weed I smoke and how territorial I am.
It's so funny because that Gordon Ryan, his last match with Pat Downey, of course, you're talking about changing the rules. They banned heel hooks. They took heel hooks out. It was the same with the match with Bo Nickel, and the one with Pat Downey. It was the first match was submission wrestling. The second match was freestyle wrestling. So it has that. It's so close to, and it has this historical precedent that you're saying. And I'm
telling you that modern no-gi grappling is closer to catch wrestling than jiu-jitsu than it is to jiu-jitsu, in my opinion, because there's no-gi, there are these leg locks, there's all these things, there's the promotional aspect, there's betting. I mean, they're so close, man. And then you have these different rule variants and things. They're so close to me.
So close, it seems.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, like you look at Craig Jones and Vinny Margulies. I mean, I kind of consider Margulies a bit of a catch guy, even though I wouldn't. I mean, Margulies is a beast, right? He's a guy who doesn't get, in my opinion, enough press. He's not running around with a crown or doing sexy Instagram videos or anything like that. Like, you know what I mean? Vinny Margulies is a badass, and one of my guys who's also a badass, Jesse Merez, he came up under Billy and I. He's friends with Margulies, and anyway.
Yeah, well, he's also hit he's hit twisters in ADCC. He's 10th planet black belt as well.
Yeah, he's a beast. Yeah, I mean, Catch, I really like Catch is so funny and like, I mean, it's so ripe to be made fun of too, because, you do have all this history and stuff, but, sometimes you look at those old pictures and the guys with the weird mustaches and the long pants and, it is a little anachronistic, but,
Oh, yeah.
What I'm really hoping for is I truly believe catch wrestling as a business is the sweet spot between UFC and WWE.
Yeah.
I think that I think there's money to be made there on a big scale between those, because I know that there's a lot of crossover fans. That's why Brock Lesnar and Ronda Rousey went to WWE and CM Punk went to UFC. I mean, there's a huge crossover appeal. I just think that, hey man, we could do something. You wouldn't have to get state athletic commissions involved because there's no punching and kicking.
Yeah.
But it's a lot like UFC in terms of it's rough, man. These guys are really going to go at it. And, I think it would be really neat to see. Like that's what I've been working on. I got a little disillusioned of trying to do it the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu way until I realized you can't, because it's not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's a whole different thing. It will never go. I mean, I just hit my head against the wall trying to make it a square peg fit in a round hole. What has to happen is that you need money again. And I hate to sound crass. I'm really not a selfish person. I mean, if I was, I'd have a lot more money. But I mean, you do need money. You need a promotion. We need a showcase. And, that's what I've been working on. So I launched the King of Catch Wrestling in 2007, which was an open tournament, but now I'm working to get funding for an actual show. I've already got the name Shoot Pro Wrestling trademarked, but whether we go with that or not, it's just a working concept. But I mean, that's the vision. And what I'd really like to do is actually have a show that is truly halfway between UFC and WWE. And by that, I mean, we would have exhibition matches like WWE. However, just like there's a hardcore title and there's a tag team title and there's a cruiserweight title, blah, 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 all these different kinds of titles, there would be a shoot title. And that shoot title is always on the level. It's always a competitive match.
Yeah, okay.
And then that way you could cycle guys in and out of the shoot division. And then when their body's too beat up from doing those hard matches all the time, you put them back into the normal wrestling belt contention where they can kind of chill out a little bit and not take so much abuse. And then when they're healed up, they go back into the shoot.
Well, that makes sense too, because Vinny just had his leg destroyed or his ankle just ripped off yesterday.
His knee or something.
Far out. So you're thinking like you have a shoot match at the top of shoot matches at the top of the card, but then give these guys a chance to just, hey, teammates, put on some exhibitions just to keep active in the meantime, and you put on some entertainment. I think that sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah, and I think if you think of it more almost like vaudeville or like a variety show, and that's really what pro wrestling is, like the WWE. It's the longest running television show in the history of the United States. No other show has been on as long as it has without a break and without reruns. I mean, something crazy like 30 or 40 years or something. So like, it's that vaudeville. One section is funny, one section is sexy, one funny is serious, one part is tragic, one is heroic, and and they just mix it all up. Well, I think that legit competitive wrestling can hold place at that table. It doesn't have to be, the whole table doesn't have to be competitive though. That's where I think people are getting mixed up and not working together. I mean, we've had fucking one of the greatest wrestlers ever go into pro wrestling, Kurt Angle. Wouldn't it be great to have him have a whole belt where people can come in and try to shoot for it? That'd be really exciting, I think, on one level.
I'm with you on that. I think it's so just interesting, just how these different worlds just keep borrowing from each other, and just the fact that I think you've got a good idea there of some another way forward to keep that progression happening. Because even with grappling, the last, I don't know how long it's been, a year or two, but Sakuraba's quintet. That's been one of the biggest changes in the grappling rule sets that's been very popular with everyone. Everyone's like, wow, this is an amazing new format. It's real entertaining, exciting. And of course, it's Sakuraba, so it's borrowed heavily from wrestling with folk style wrestling, team duels. He made, really quick stalling calls for people to keep the action going, banned close guard and heel hooks to keep the action going. and of course, and that's just, it's made it exciting. That team format lends itself to telling, you get these naturally arising storylines where people avenge the losses of their teammates. And that's become one of the biggest things in grappling the last couple of years. Again, that crossover from those historical precedents.
Well, you even see people now, and this was something, so I almost had this Shoot Pro Wrestling. Well, it was going to be the King of Catch Wrestling Championships. We were going to make it an invitational, kind of do what Eddie Bravo did and take it out of an open tournament format and make it an invitational. Well, we got all the way to the end, and about a month prior, it just kind of folded. We just ended up having some coordination issues that just it precluded us from actually putting the show on, which sucked. However, we got really, really close. And one of the things I wanted to do, and fortunately I see other people doing it now, was tag team grappling. Yeah. So I've seen these competitions where I can't remember the name of them.
Yeah, Chael Sonnen's Submission Underground has put on a couple of tag team matches.
Tag teams, okay, yeah. I mean, it's like amazing, man. Like, this is the kind of thinking, like, is everybody trying to reinvent the book? You can go back and look at these ideas that these other promoters have worked on in the past, and there's money in them.
And of course, Chael Sonnen, another person who borrowed, whatever, from the pro wrestling play.
Oh, he's very much a pro wrestler. He totally is a heel, like a Jesse Ventura was.
Yeah. I think he said lines at press conferences which were taken from directly word for word, I think, from old pro wrestling footage, and and he made a lot of money doing it. He changed the game in promotional side for the UFC, and probably was the lead in for Conor, which again, Conor changed the game, and and we're still figuring where this is all going to run into.
Well, interesting to tie it all back. Billy Robinson and I were in the room with Chael and Neil Melanson and Randy Couture the night before Sonnen Silva won, the one where he took him all the way to at the very end gets triangled.
Yeah, I know it well.
Billy and I were over at Couture's gym doing a seminar for Neil Melanson, and then Randy wanted Billy to come in and give Chael some pointers right before. It's kind of crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's cool to be like a fly in the wall in that room.
Yeah, that's historic moments.
Yeah, it's cool.
And so I guess tying it all up, so now for you, I mean, obviously we're recording this in the middle of a global pandemic, so there's not much happening at the moment, but for you, what do you what are your offerings now with Catch? You spend a lot of time with Billy Robinson, putting on seminars around the world and running training sessions with him. So, how was that? And, and how did that evolve into what you're offering now, or what can people do to pursue it through you?
Well, so in about, I guess it was 2004. I think it was 2004. That's when I first started talking with Carl Gotch, and he really started helping me, mentoring me in my coaching. But, it wasn't enough. And I definitely didn't have any of the good technical stuff, the catch wrestling. It's really, really technical stuff of catch wrestling. Yet I thought I did, but I had no idea. I mean, I had zero now that I look back. And, and I would do good. I could hold my own. But when I started learning from Billy, it's when everything changed. Carl was giving me more strategy ideas, how to run practice, how to motivate the guys, that kind of stuff. When I started working with Billy, it was all hands-on, and it was actually pretty fucking high pressure because I brought Billy out originally in 2006, which was actually kind of a quid pro quo between me and Josh Barnett. I had hooked Josh up with Carl for a magazine shoot for one of the sport magazines out of Japan. And later on, he was like, "Hey, you know Billy Robinson?" "Oh yeah, of course." "Oh, can you hook me up?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, no problem." I mean, Josh is one of the greatest guys ever. So anyway, I brought Billy out, and we just really hit it off. And I'm sure it had to do with my exposure to Carl before, getting my sensibilities straight about things. So, man, I spent 7 years with Billy Robinson as his right-hand man. And basically I had to do everything because he was physically broken down. Like, I mean, people could see the videos. He was in awful shape by the end of his life, in a lot of pain. And so I had to do everything. And man, it was a quick learning curve because he is a perfectionist and not patient, and he'll hit you with the cane or call you cuss words or whatever. And so I'm having to learn there with this guy as my headmaster, and in a room full of like alpha males wanting to learn how to kill each other. And that's like, that was my school, like how to coach. And I did that for 7 years. So, I look at it almost like one of those internships in the medieval guilds. It took 7 years to become a master, whatever, So I paid my dues with Billy for 7 years touring around. And
wow.
Anyway, count, hundreds and hundreds of hours with him on the mat, learning how to coach.
And now you run the coaching clinics, coaching sessions, is that?
Yeah, so I've been real lucky to be able to keep that going, and I've had a lot of really great friends, guys who are 1,000 times better than me, guys like Josh Barnett and guys like Wade Chalice that also go out with me and tour. I have so you were saying, like, what am I doing? I've been doing this coaching thing for Billy and I started in 2007, he died in 2014, and then I've kept it going. So it's been going for a minute, like 13 years or whatever. But, right before all this lockdown stuff happened, I got a call, speaking of Danaher, speaking of Gordon Ryan, all those guys, I got a call or an email from a BJJ Fanatics. And just out of the blue, they were like, "Hey, man, you want to do an instructional?" I was like, "What? Me?" And they're like, "Yeah." And I guess somehow they heard. I probably should find out why they even asked me. But so I flew out there, and we did a 2 DVD set in Boston, flew out to their studios. Me and Sam Crescent, who's my right-hand man. He's been with me probably the longest. He's a really tough guy, great catch wrestler, great coach, BJJ black belt 3rd degree under Chris Howder. Cool dude, but like very hardcore about catch wrestling too. So we flew out there, filmed these videos, and then the lockdown happened. So I know that they've been saying that I asked them and they sent me in quotes, I'm quoting what they said, it's selling very well with an exclamation point. So I was happy to hear that, because I feel like I'm a nobody. So to have it selling well is really exciting to me. But the problem is that the same thing that everybody else is probably experiencing that gives a shit about this sport is just utter fucking frustration. And like the people that own businesses that also love the sport are probably having more than frustration. They're probably having despair and fucking anger and sadness and because of businesses shutting and stuff. So it's been hard for me too, because I rely on gyms. That's who I sell to. They bring me out and I do seminars or I do training camps or whatever. And these gyms have just been decimated by all this. So on one hand, I'm really excited because my DVD came out and everybody's stuck at home and has to watch it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm like raring to go. I'm like, come on, man, let's get going. Because I mean, the other thing is as an athlete or even as a coach, you have a shelf life. There's only a certain amount of time you got to do these things. These are my prime years for coaching, and I just want to get to it.
Well, I hope to check out the BJJ Fanatics stuff myself, and hopefully one day when it all clears up and normality is resumed, hopefully we can start training in the gyms today, and I can get out and go to one of your seminars and check out what you're doing in person. I think that'd be great.
Oh fun. Man, I'd love to come out to Australia, man.
Yeah,
figure out. I mean, there's Harry Kimura is out there too.
Yeah.
He's very into catch wrestling. So it's just how catch wrestling is. You end up having a small, hardcore group of people. But in a place like Australia, that's going to be even smaller because there's just, population isn't as big as like, say, the United States.
Oh yeah. I know Harry. I've done some seminars with him. He's a great guy.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I'm excited for is, especially with that BJJ Fanatics deal, is I know that, they are clearly, it's in their name. That's where they came from. They're massively successful. Their market is 1,000 times bigger than my market in catch wrestling. And that's BJJ. And what I've been loving is that I am not built like Ken Shamrock. I'm like the opposite. I'm like a beanpole. I'm a really tall, lanky, thinner guy, and to see, what I'm excited to see is, and some of the feedback I've been getting on the reviews on the BJJ Fanatics site for the sales page, is that people's minds are blown how technical and brute force oriented catch as catch can be, that it's very much, it's mean and nasty as hell. There's no getting over that, but you don't need a lot of muscle or anything. It's all truly scientific. It's leverage, it's torque, it's angles, it's timing, like it's very technical sport. And so that's one of the things that I've been really excited to see is kind of that stereotype that you were talking about earlier, hopefully undoing that a little bit and having people see it in a slightly different way.
Man, that'll be awesome to see that happen. I think it's certainly possible, and I like your ideas with the shoot pro wrestling. It's got some great. I think the concept's great, and they're using that as a training system.
Well, now that I know that you guys have a smoke machine and a DJ, you guys got like every month, dude.
Yeah, I know. I'll be probably the first person I'll call will be Nikki, and I'll be like, Nikki, you won't believe what I just realized. You started something. She wanted it to be, the biggest, At the time, it was like, really, a smoke machine? But now, hey.
That's awesome.
It came
That's
off.
how you do it.
It was great. It was like, that was actually pretty cool.
Yeah, and here we are talking about it like months or years later or whatever, right? Like, it's truly epic. You got to. Yeah, and it's like, you get your,
now that you mention it,
involved. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was great. And I also hope that the negotiations in the future between Gordon Ryan and whichever wrestler he takes on next, I'm sure there'll be someone. We got to get in the ears of the wrestler and say, hey, ask for a pin.
Yeah, I think pinning, and I'd love to see kind of a funk style wrestler, like an Askren in his prime, like that kind of, that would be a really fun, exciting match to watch. And it's harder to pin somebody than you think, and it's funny because the other thing is that, a lot of times back in the day anyway, you heard this story about how Rickson Gracie beat Mark Schultz.
Yeah.
Who's a friend of mine. So I've heard him tell the tale, and it's not told in the same way when you hear it from Mark's perspective. I mean, Mark was scared to death because he said that anything goes, and he was scared. He thought this guy was going to bite him and kill him or rip his throat out. Like, Mark was freaked out. But Mark goes in there and he ends up getting Rickson in, guess what? A cradle, and holds Rickson for a half hour. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I know everybody talks like, oh yeah, like, wrestling's not good for street defense or anything. I mean, he held Rickson Gracie in one position that he couldn't mount an offense from for a half hour. Rickson won because Mark's grip gave after holding a cradle for a half hour, and then Rickson crawled around and got the choke. But that's a guy who doesn't know any submission whatsoever, really. Although you can say that, we were talking about how difficult wrestling can be, and sometimes people will tap. Normal, like your average jiu-jitsu, maybe blue belt would tap to something that is just a pin for a normal collegiate wrestler or whatever, just because it's really uncomfortable and painful. But, Mark Schultz and Dave Schultz, both excellent gold medalist, world champion wrestlers,
Mark Schultz breaking the arm of someone with a double wrist lock with the
in the finals. In the finals. But Dave and Mark both worked their way all the way up using the Schultz headlock, which was really choking everybody out, and the refs didn't know. So that's something you always have to remember too, that there's a lot of stuff going on in wrestling and the refs don't even know. You know what I mean? That there are submissions or nasty moves happening, and it's just the ref doesn't even have a clue about what's going on. And so the Schultz headlock is a perfect example of a submission that comes from folk style wrestling. And it's 100% a submission, man. It'll knock you out as much as any blood choke.
And it seems like that just the wrestling, catch wrestling, the jiu-jitsu, grappling, the promotion side and, making money, and the training side, it's just it's interlinked. There's no way around it.
I mean, it truly is the best business. It's the greatest business in the world if you're kind of a bit of a dude with a little bit of testosterone. You get awesome friends, then you can start making money, and then all you do is bullshit about it. I mean, it's like if you could figure out how to make a living in this business, it's one of the best businesses to be in. It's hard, but it's great if you're into it,
No doubt. Jake, it's been an awesome conversation. I've liked every moment of it, going through all those historical tidbits. If people want to get in touch with you, if people want to follow you, how do they go about doing that?
Well, the main hub of everything I do, I try to put it on scientificwrestling.com. So that's, I've filmed a bunch of stuff, recorded a bunch of stuff, whether it's historical or instructional, and written a bunch of stuff. And a lot of it is available there. So that's probably the easiest way. In terms of social media, I'm just going to be honest, like, I'm just not one of these guys that wants to do something 6 times. So I just focus on one instead of trying to do some on YouTube and some on Facebook and I'm just kind of an Instagram guy. I've just kind of settled there. I've found a medium that fits my style. And so Instagram is probably the thing I update the most. And there's just a shit ton of stuff I post on Instagram from, obviously stupid jokes and memes and stuff like that. But technique clips or, historical, a lot of these old historical photos of these holds that have been going back, a couple hundred years at least that we have photos of. So awesome. Instagram, and I think that's just scientific wrestling. You just, @ scientific wrestling on Instagram.
Awesome. So scientific wrestling on Instagram, and check out the instructionals up at BJJ Fanatics.
Yeah, and if you go to the Instagram, I have it in the link in bio or whatever, the BJJ thing. So if you just want to go straight to that, just go to the Instagram. It's easier. Awesome.
Jake, thanks very much for coming on the show. Wonderful conversation, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, Sonny, man, you're the man. I really appreciate everything you're doing. I love watching your YouTube channel in particular, but just keep it up, man. It's catch wrestling is really interesting. Once you get bit by the bug, man, it's like, oof, it's worse than COVID-19.
Yeah, I just, all those little rabbit holes, you just keep going down. It's fascinating stuff. So thank you. I appreciate it a lot. And thanks so much. And that concludes this episode of the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Please leave a review of the iTunes store and check out sonnybrown.net to links to all my social media. Thanks.